palmistry? Do you think gypsy fortune telling, caravan scam? Well, think again. Chirology, as it's now known, has advanced a lot in the last few years, and Jennifer Hirsch is South Africa's leading and groundbreaking chirologist. I had a chance to interview her on Skype. I know that you're a palmist, but I know that you don't really use that word, and that word even to me sounds a little bit quaint. So the first thing I really want to ask you, because I know you describe yourself as a chirologist, and I've even heard palmistry sometimes called chirology, but I don't think they're the same. Can you tell me, are they the same, or what is the difference? Palmistry,
well,
chirology.
Chirology, as you quite correctly referenced, comes from the word cheri, meaning hand, and logos, knowledge of. So it's an umbrella term that encompasses all aspects of knowledge of the hand, under which palmistry fits. So we embrace the best of traditional palmistry, and then we bring in this added faculty now, which is more, let's say, modern, and that is the counseling and coaching approach to the reading of the hands. So it's not so much chronological like old palmistry, past, present, future, predictive, as it is qualitative, in the now, holistic, and looking at the whole person and all the various component parts of their life.
A lot of people, when they hear you talking about hand reading, think of, gypsy caravans and the old-fashioned fortune. But you go in there and out comes, the take out your palm, and there's that whole mystical thing. And, I always liked to believe that those caravans were real and those are talented people. But whether they were or not, and I'll never know, I think palmistry's got this taint that comes from that. Is that the distant past, or is that still palmistry as we know it?
Yes, the whole bunch of stuff that comes down the lineage of the traditional Western palmistry, and I say Western because the origin of palmistry is a bit lost, but the idea is that it began somewhere in India and related with the gypsies, who are Indian bloodline, up through Egypt and Greece, basically, and then into Eastern Europe, and from there migrated westward across to Western palmistry as we know it in, say, England and so on. So there's been this big migration, and because these people were so nomadic and so on, and they had to learn to live off the land, they definitely evolved survival skills, which included basically calibrating people, being able to read people, using the gift of their gab, and being very shrewd about it. So that is what gives palmistry such a terrible bad press, that, it's all just a con situation. And there's definitely a component of that, but there's even a component of that that comes into modern-day chirology, because we need to be able to calibrate people, we need the gift of the gab, we need to be able to use our intuition and to connect into what it is in that person that's their most vulnerable areas and so on. The difference is, of course, it's done with compassion,
right,
insight, and counseling backup and stuff.
That kind of palmistry, which I guess was carrying an ancient tradition that had adapted to circumstances and, as you say, associated with a lot of clever manipulation as well, and all of that kind of talking. That kind of palmistry, of course, was also closely related to astrology, which is something that interests me. I know that palmistry, of course, uses parts of the hand are named after planets. Those planets on your hand, are they the same as my planets in my astrological chart, is my question.
So we use those in chirology, but we've sort of extended it beyond that and now brought in the system of the elements, so earth, water, and chi, or ether is actually the sort of scientifically correct word for the chi principle. I like to call it chi because it's a play on chirology.
Of course.
So the CHI, so I use a particular license there. But it represents a spiritual sort of thread that runs through all our lives, and that's a very important part of the coaching context of chirology.
I have a feeling that's a little bit of what's been lost in India in the relationship between palmistry and astrology, because originally in India the idea of astrology is that it's not only the study of the planets and stars, it includes everything that is about the spiritual nature. The word for astrology in India means light or seeing with eyes. It's how we see. And so when they included palmistry and other aspects, they had this idea of a much more holistic thing then just this line means that, and that's going to send you to that destiny. And I think that's kind of been lost somewhere along the way. And perhaps chirology is beginning to get back to the original thought of the great sages or whatever. That is really that there's a whole being here. And in the same way that you're not just your hand, you're not just astrology or just one little narrow way of looking at a person.
Yes. So I totally second that. It's really, that's what's so beautiful about chirology, that it specifically defines your spiritual and religious life as being 1/5 of the coaching counseling model, and none of those are any less important than the next. Obviously, we need work, we need to be healthy, we need money, we need relationships, etc., etc. So every client comes, we explore what's going on with their spiritual lives, and often a lot of us are very wounded in that area. There's a lot of damage being done, all sorts of double standards and disappointments and disillusion and disconnect from God and so on. So I do, being very spiritual myself, I do emphasize that.
Do you not find that clients expect the gypsy hand reading?
Very much so. Yeah, I have to educate each one of them using the gift of the gab, to be honest, because that's the way it works.
Sure.
I really develop a rapport. I managed to develop a rapport with most of my clients and things. Yeah, and explain. It wouldn't really serve them if I could be, when you were 5, your brother hit you on the head with a cricket bat or something. It's a silly example, but this is what they want.
So then I've got 2 questions then. So on the one hand, do you think there is still any value in traditional palmistry? Like if someone went and bought that book by, what is his name, Cairo, the guy who called himself Cairo, I think about 100 years ago or something. His book is slim print. I still see it everywhere.
Yes, it's slim print. And it's odd because it's really not, his books aren't really very good. They lack any kind of system. They're very random and very difficult to learn from them. But he had this incredible charisma. He was a seer, and a lot of what he writes in his books, if you take out little pockets of it, little sort of, if you've got a bent baby finger, you distort communication channels for vested interests, or you have a very hollow palm, your bowl will never be empty, and there are a whole bunch of meanings like that, and they can be very accurate. So, in a sense, you can draw out some treasures, but I wouldn't advise potential students of hand reading to base their studies on Cairo's books, definitely not. Or any of the old palmistry books for that.
And then I have seen other modern authors who've at least, I looked at one of them, did include a little bit about the information about fingerprints that I've learned from you. And so it does seem that there's that realization that we need a more modern, wider approach. But you do in your book, so you mentioned things to do with touch. I was fascinated that you talk about handshakes, for example. So we, in our Western culture, we all shake each other's hands. How do you feel about that? Is it a good thing? Is there an energy transfer? Are we making ourselves vulnerable?
Definitely. I mean, if you're a reader or you're calibrating people's energy, you can tell a whole bunch from a handshake. Interesting you asked, does it make you vulnerable? In the East, traditionally, and also the African culture, they shake very softly. There's something sort of, they don't convey anything in the way they shake hands. It's all very respectful. There's almost like...
Definitely, that soft African handshake is like convey I'm harmless.
Yes.
And Sangomas don't shake hands at all. Oh. So if someone reaches out to shake your hand, you just do this. You show your empty hands. But you don't actually make physical contact, and that's really exactly why. You don't want energy transfer of any kind. You don't want their stuff. Because, it's like communication via the hands. So you talk about gesture and handshakes. You talk about the Indian system of mudra, which is, some people call it hand yoga, the movement into certain positions of the hand. Which always fascinated me. I mean, in India, I went to great lengths to find information about mudra. I was very lucky I did. So on the one hand, there's that communication, and there's that subtle layer of communication that you're capable of achieving. Tell me a little bit of what you think about mudras.
Mudra is hand yoga, as you just said, and basically there are thousands of different positions one can hold one's hands. But obvious ones are when you hold onto your thumbs when you're anxious, so that's supposed to ground you. Lots of people do that very unconsciously.
True.
And like the chin, chin mudra, I think it's called, where we meditate and we hold our fingers together. So if we take that a little step further into chirological analysis, each finger represents a different element, and the thumb represents the God principle. So this represents me, I myself, the index finger, the water finger, it represents your personal identity. So by holding the thumb, God, with this finger, myself, I align myself with God. If you meditate holding your middle finger, it has a different meaning. It has to do with grounding yourself. It's like you're wearing a ring there, I'll notice now. So that's like a way to actually literally add weight to that finger, which is the finger of Saturn finger. It's grounding yourself, ground yourself, and so on through the fingers. So that's just a little bit on those particular mudras. And then there are many others, and I sometimes teach them in my groups just to, help people to calm down. I use the Concha mudra, and I can't remember all the names right now, but yeah.
Oh. So, because I've seen that they're connected to health. I mean, some mudras apparently you can use to stop a heart attack, or I don't know, to an extent or every bit. So there's obviously and I think a lot of chirology is based on this premise of the relationship between the small and the great. So, like the hand can relate to the entire being, or acupuncture, or people use the ear or the sole of the foot to relate to the whole self. Is hand analysis also working that way then?
Yeah, that's the microcosm of the macrocosm. Yeah. And then with the element system, it overlays principles of the elements in terms of scientific terms. So earth is solid and water is fluid and fire is energetic and so on. And then that is the known. And then we seek to define the unknown, which is the hand, and all the markings on the hand in terms of the known, which is the elements. And then we have a beautiful system that can help us develop a vocabulary that can support the person in feeling understood, feeling heard, feeling encouraged, feeling coached, feeling healed, really. Combined then with the holding of the hands, which is this touch.
Holding hands is just a simple gesture, but the level of connectedness that it actually creates, if you think about it, is very profound. And in the same way, as you said, as we hold our thumbs, how holding hands can make you feel so cared for, so safe, so all of those things, and it's really just a hand, which I think proves a lot of the point. You mentioned your new book, which looks great. I remember your book, God-Given Gifts, such a great name for a book as well. But I'm very excited to hear about your new book. Tell us.
Well, I've got a copy of it right here.
Yes.
It looks like that.
Wow.
It's a guidebook for hand readers. And that's been my big deal my whole life, because I've been at this 28 years now. And I didn't have a formal education. And I had a lot of challenge stepping into the role of my own authority in terms of doing counseling work, doing healing work. I suffered with that a lot. And I meet a lot of people who are in the same boat. And they really are natural-born healers and therapists, but they don't have a sense of confidence around that. So when I teach, that's my big thing, is to support people in assuming their own authority, putting on that hat, feeling confident about it. And that's the purpose of this book. It's basically comprised of almost 300 mini tutorials on every aspect of hand reading. And there are chapters on intuition and chapters on counseling and coaching that come into the mix here. So it's not just about this marking means that.
Well, I know. I mean, the whole first section of that book, that I had a quick look at it, it's very, very rich information. I mean, I looked at that book and I thought, this could be for more than just chirologists. There's a lot of other people working, especially in intuitive-related fields, etc., and in astrology, who could do with reading the first half of that book, even if they never look at a hand. But there's this way of understanding the human being in a bigger context, and that a person who is a reader, be it hands or charts or whatever, actually needs a certain amount of background in that, because traditional astrology is much more complete and has got a context for itself, which it lost over history. What I think you and people in your field today are doing are rebuilding the context back into chirology that was lost. But as I was saying, in all these fields, because there's this missing thing, and so people say, you need to study psychology to do astrology, or study psychology to do palmistry, and that doesn't make sense to me. It's just within the field, we should have all the tools that we need. And I think that's what you're developing with that book. that you're drawing on knowledge we do have in modern times about counseling and so on, but you're creating a context that belongs to your field and perhaps to some of our fields, related fields as well. And that's what I think is very exciting and quite important about that book. That's why I think it's, even if people are not so much interested necessarily in chirology, but are in somewhat related fields, I think it's quite important for them to read that.
Love that, because absolutely one wants to bring in the how to deliver, if you want to use one word, into the whole spectrum of the actual modalities. It's not a separate modality.
Right.
I mean, at the moment, one does need to encourage all chirology students to at least have some grounding in counselling.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to teach. I mean, I do now teach that in my course.
So you talk about 5-realm counselling and coaching. Can you tell me what that is?
So it's a model. It's similar to any coaching and counseling model, which is, the traditional model of this coaching wheel you might have, I'm sure, bumped into.
Mm-hmm.
People don't know about it. It's simply a circle that's divided into facets, and each facet represents a different area of one's life. And we have exactly the same thing, but it's built in a kind of almost like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs type, and from the ground up, so to speak, earth to water to fire to air. And it's the physical, the emotional, the vocational, the mental, and the spiritual. And then each of those subclassify into a different strata of those. The physical might be health, family, money, country, and so on through each level. And then we give our guidance and our coaching, counseling, and our conversation within that context. So it provides a kind of a safety net, like a context that is so key to how to do hand reading in a way that is therapeutic and supportive of the person. It just doesn't just wow them because you come up with some psychic kind of input.
Yeah.
Or you tell them that they definitely will have a child and you try and placate them in that way.
And so you've drawn on some of the models we have from coaching, and that there are these basic steps and categories. But I also noticed you draw on element theory, the traditional Western element theory of the 4 elements, which I think informs early psychology. It's hidden in a lot of the way we understand and handle ourselves. And what's quite new is the emphasis on fingerprints that you mentioned. I mean, we associate palmistry a lot with lines and mounds, kind of, I guess we call them the bumps on the hand. People always want to know what that word means. But you talk a lot about fingerprints. And fingerprints is the kind of newer part of palmistry.
It's the most fascinating thing, really, that you open all these old books, like Cairo's books and so on. There's not even one mention of fingerprints.
It's bizarre, actually.
That myth of Magellan's ships, they had no context for these ships, so they couldn't see them. It's the same thing with the fingerprints. It's as if these older palm readers didn't actually perceive them.
It's so strange, because you'd think they're fascinating.
Yeah. So, I mean, fingerprint consciousness really also came in at the turn of the last century. And the early fingerprint systems and pioneers and so on started to come up, the late 1800s, actually. So, fingerprints tell a great deal. Each fingerprint is allocated or assigned a different element, and then they are interpreted in accordance with the principles of that element. So there are 4 primary fingerprint patterns, and then there are 2 composite patterns, which are two of those combined, and then there's a 7th category, which is to do with what they call variants or accidentals, is another terminology there. So there are basically only 7 possible fingerprints in the whole wide world.
Types of shapes, wow.
Yeah, the different forms.
And that manages to make unique fingerprints for everyone. That's incredible. I read somewhere, it might have been your book, might have been a different one, that because of forensics, and fingerprints starting to be tracked that way, kind of scientifically by observation, they began to notice that there's a stronger tendency for criminals to have certain fingerprint shapes, which is absolutely intriguing. So is that brought into chirology at all?
Fingerprints are very much reference to health.
Right.
So in that regard, there's a whole lot of very fascinating...
There are. I've got a book from the 60s called The Doctor's Guide to Palmistry. Now, I know I've seen various books like from India, certain shapes will mean certain diseases and so on, and it's kind of traditional palmistry. But this was book. I don't know if you ever came across it. And it's strictly kind of medical. It's not. So he's a doctor doing palmistry, but it's all science. And he also established, for example, that there's a pattern on the hand that is an almost sure sign that someone's going to have a heart attack.
There is research about heart disease, and it's the axial triradius,
right,
which is a little triangle which generally sits here at the base of the hand, and when it travels up and gets misplaced, it changes the ADT triangle, which is not a complicated thing. It's a scientific thing about how they measure the specific triangulation. And based on that, there's a predisposition to either acquired or congenital heart disease.
Wow.
So those are, it's theoretical. These steps and these systems that these scientists do might have quite a small, might be 1,000 people, might be 50 people. So one doesn't want to be too emphatic about it. Like, don't think because you've got a misplaced triangle, axial radius, you're definitely going to have a heart attack. That would be done.
No, that would be scary. But I think the important thing is that they're willing to make those connections and start realizing there's a lot that the body's telling us.
Yeah. In fact, can I quickly tell you something very interesting?
For sure.
There's in 1980 there was a book published that this particular palmist maintains that in German universities at the time there was a doctor, I can't remember his name, who claimed to be able to tell with 80% accuracy whether a newborn infant, based on his fingerprints, or rather palmar genetoglyphics, would, in the course of his or her lifetime, acquire a disease, and it would be diabetes, schizophrenia, cancer, leukemia. For some reason, they separate leukemia, cancer, and heart disease. And they even apparently teach courses in these universities on this exact subject. Wow. So the health diagnosis via the hands, like iridology and so on, is becoming huge.
So you do teach chirology as well. Presumably you're training professionals. Do a lot of people practice?
So I've got some amazing students who really carried the torch forward. But I've taught probably, I would say, close to 300 people. And most of them do it as a hobby, as an interesting hobby, rather than as a profession. Yeah. Or they'll use it as an augmentation to what they do. So they're working as some sort of healing therapist in some capacity, and then they'll also do the hands as a separate thing, as a separate offering. It's not like purists. They're not only doing hands.
I think palmistry might suffer from the same problem that astrology does, is people keep on trying to fit it into a predefined box of what science says it is, and what science says science is, and all of that, and that frightens some people off. And there are people who won't become professional astrologers because it's the 21st century. I don't know people what are going to think of me if I'm some kind of a mystic or something like that. But I think people need to understand that things have gone to another level. And what excites me is that, right here in South Africa, we've got that we've got one of I'm just assuming this, but I just feel that it's true because I read a lot and I see a lot and I pay attention to what's on the shelves. But you are one of the thought leaders in chirology today in the world, and you've helped advance it, and you've helped make people aware. The quality of your books, it's like there will be people watching this who are not palmists or haven't read a palmistry book, and you need to read a book like that to understand the depth and the richness and the sensitivity that you, Jen, bring to it, but that is also in this world. That it's not the simplistic thing that you remember from your folks going to a caravan. So hopefully people will begin to understand that, and also start perhaps thinking about studying it themselves. There is clearly room for more chirologists in the world. So how do they do that? How do people contact you, and how do they find your books?
Thank you, Rod. I've plodded away for all these years, and I just love the idea of encouraging people, anyone, take another person's hands in yours. Give them that act of generosity. Be present for what people are going through in their lives. And even, in a way, at the end of the day, you can do my course, but a lot of it, there's a saying from Osho, actually, he says, any type of healing modality, 10% technique, 90% love. And if you've got that love in your heart, then you can do hand reading. It's that simple. So how they get in touch with me? Well, I've got a website, godgivenglyphs.com. I have, obviously, my email address, my phone numbers are freely available. I've got a Facebook page that's dedicated to hand reading. Anyone
Well,
open
that's
to.
great. I'm sure if people go to your website, they'll be able
Thank,
to sign up and find you
thank,
from there. And
yes.
to buy your book, so that they can order online.
Yeah,
Great.
yeah, yeah.
And as I say, I hope they read it, even if they're not particularly necessarily just palmistry, but to realize more as well.
Yeah, and my courses, just to mention, I teach quite more and more on Skype, which is really, I love to do that, just one-on-one training. So wherever you are in the world, that's really works for me. And it's a 20-lesson course, quite in depth. You get lots of material, and we develop a beautiful rapport over 20 deep conversations. So, yeah.
Fascinating and enlightening stuff. I will be back next week, Friday, 8 p.m., the usual time. See you then.